Good evening, and welcome to the National Building Museum. On behalf of the Board of Trustees and the entire staff, I am delighted to welcome you back to the museum. My name is Chase Rind, and I have the privilege of being the executive director here. And it is my great honor to have all of you with us on this wonderful occasion, the presentation of the 2019 Vincent Scully Prize. The Vincent Scully Prize is always a very special evening. So many of our friends and colleagues join us for what is a lively and truly unique honor within the field. Thank you all for celebrating with us tonight, as you have in years past. The National Building Museum was established nearly 40 years ago. Next year is our 40th birthday. As the nation's leading cultural institution devoted to the history and impact of the built environment. We have raised public awareness about the many historic, social, and cultural issues associated with the buildings and landscapes that shape our world. One of the most important and enduring ways that the National Building Museum accomplishes this is through the Vincent Scully Prize. The prize was established in 1999 in partnership with architect David Schwarz to honor contributions to the study, teaching, and public understanding of the built environment. The museum is grateful to David for his years supporting the prize, and we thank him for his vision in establishing this prestigious award. Unfortunately, David is not able to join us this evening, but he is thrilled by this year's honoree. The prize is selected by a jury who are themselves scholars and experienced practitioners in architectural scholarship and criticism, architecture, landscape architecture, historic preservation, planning, and urban design. I do want to thank those jury members who were unable to join us this evening: James Corner, Ellen Dunham-Jones, and Blair Kamen. And with us tonight are jury member Maurice Cox, newly appointed Commissioner of Planning and Economic Development for Chicago. Maurice, thank you for being here. Thank you. And we have our jury chair, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, also a former laureate of the prize. Please join me in welcoming Liz to the podium to begin our program. Liz?
Good evening. It's great to see such a crowd here this evening. This evening, it's my distinct honor to introduce the recipient of the 19th Vincent Scully Prize, Elizabeth K. Meyer. Landscape architect, theorist, historian, and university professor. The Merrill D. Peterson Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Virginia School of Architecture, Beth Meyer has made exceptional intellectual contributions, fostering an understanding of the rich relationship between landscapes, the built environment, and the people who inhabit them. Recognized internationally as one of the most significant theorists in her field, Beth has made an indelible mark on design education, scholarship, and practice, tackling questions of aesthetics, sustainability, culture, and social impact. The long list of her design projects, articles, books, and lectures shows a value-driven initiative and a rigorous vocabulary that support her inquiry into the socio-ecological entanglements of contemporary life. Examining natural and designed landscapes through the lens of human relationships with the biophysical world, she is keenly aware of change. Informed by the humanities and the sciences, her work does not shy from emerging concerns such as climate change and increasing economic inequity. In addition to her role as a scholar, Beth has steadfastly nurtured a broad community of designers, teachers, scholars, and writers. Tonight, you will see not only the gravitas that guides her dedication, but also the generosity of spirit and deep optimism that has inspired her fans in design and academic communities around the world. Beth's trajectory reminds us that landscape architecture has its own history and theory, with a language and a literacy that must be learned. Her affirmation of the fundamental role of landscape in placemaking is indeed a powerful legacy. Those lucky enough to learn from her, work alongside her, or just listen to her encounter Beth's capacity to see landscape in the built world as both immensely complex and worthy of engagement. Her good deeds in research and writing have been recognized in many ways. She has also been rewarded, as in No Good Deed Goes Unpunished, with professional, administrative, and civic responsibilities. Beth has served as Dean of the University of Virginia School of Architecture and currently is a member of the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts here in Washington. They meet right in this same building. The Scully Prize jury concisely summarized her qualities and achievements. Elizabeth Meyer embodies the very spirit of Vincent Scully as a master lecturer who inspired generations of practitioners. Integrating research and writing with professional, administrative, and civic responsibilities, Professor Meyer has produced an influential body of theory, interpretation, and criticism on landscape topics related to aesthetics, sustainability, culture, and social impact. You will learn more about Professor Meyer and her work this evening in a conversation guided by her friend and colleague, Thaisa Way, Program Director of Garden and Landscape Studies at the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collections. I look forward to tonight's conversation. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Meyer and Thaisa Way.
Yeah, so why don't you start?
Thais and I, we talk a lot, usually in smaller venues, lobbies of hotels at conferences. So this is a real treat to share our banter with you. I did want to say just a couple of things before we got started in gratitude. I am so moved by this recognition that carries the name of one of the most influential educators of the 20th century. I had the great luck to hear Vincent Scully a couple of times, most recently in the late 90s. And he was a memorable speaker whose passion for decoding architecture was contagious. I aspire to his impact, and I hope to have his longevity so that I might come close. While respected for many things, Scully's approach to architectural history included a very strong landscape sensibility. Whether he was examining Greek temples or shingle-style architecture, he wove connections between their form and their structure with the broader landscape setting. Now, to be clear, I don't use the descriptive language that Vincent Scully did. Many of you know his books include Architecture, the Natural and the Man-Made. And for those of you who've had my classes and have heard my feminist critique of binaries, that title is one I wouldn't use. But Socio, ecological entanglements, I do. So I'm interested in the same things, but come at it from another generation and another gender and another discipline. No doubt Thaisa and I will talk about the reasons why I feel so strongly about words and literacy and landscape, because they often get in the way of seeing places that can be catalytic and transformative for the people who we serve. So I couldn't have developed my own voices and methods as a critic and a theorist without the writings of someone like Scully. My relationship with him might be characterized as a Venturian both and. I sought vocabularies and techniques for releasing the design landscape, and the reading of sites from what might be understood as a background setting for architectural interpretation. I wanted the forms and spaces of the design landscapes to be understood for their intentionality, for their own materiality and complexity. I wanted the landscape medium, plants and microtopography, atmosphere and temporality, to be appreciated for the role it plays in shaping the art form that I know as landscape architecture. So I want to ask you to indulge me with just one more aside before our conversation, because this space is also extremely moving and meaningful, and it's why I'm so touched and overwhelmed. Over 40 years ago, I came into this building with Bates Lowry and Pamela Scott. Bates, as many of you know, was the first director of the National Building Museum, and I had the great privilege in the summer of 1979, between 2 semesters at Cornell, of helping them with the research for the first architectural exhibition here. And I spent the summer half the time in moldy archives, half the time feeling like I was Harriet the Spy, trying to find things that, beautiful drawings by Latrobe and others that Pamela and Bates had heard were sitting in Department of Interior offices with push pins up on the walls. So that summer was extraordinary for me to see this building every month restored and alive compared to the sad pile it was in '79. And to think about that first exhibition that we worked on, building a national image, architectural drawings for the American democracy, reminds me that this building introduced me to a different way of thinking about design that wasn't about just the landscape medium, but about ideas and ideals, social values, and politics. I came to appreciate the meaning, not just the medium, of design through this building and through Bates and through Pamela. And so I wanted to thank them and this building for part of the arc that I'm on. And I'm excited about the conversation that Thaisa and I are about to launch.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah. So I'm going to launch right in, and you gave a beautiful tribute to this building, but we're here to honor you this evening. So I wonder if you could roll back a little bit and talk a little bit about how you came to hold the kinds of perspectives and views that you've developed and that you've shared with so many of us.
I think a lot of people who work in the arena of design and public space, like me, come to it sideways. I started architecture school not because I wanted to be an architect, but because I wanted to make cities better. And I had an experience of cities that a lot of people my age did in the mid-'60s. My experience of cities was, or cities of urban renewal. We lived in Virginia Beach. My mom and dad worked in Norfolk, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. Like week by week, something was being demolished, and not such great stuff being built in its stead. Same thing in Rochester, where my parents grew up and my grandparents lived. So I got interested in design through demolition and wondering why are these old buildings being torn down, why are these communities being displaced. And that was juxtaposed with an amazing experience of public space that I had as a Navy brat growing up on beaches. I spent way too much time on boardwalks and beaches. That was my public space, this incredible promenade of bodies of every type and age and size, dynamic place with erosion and deposition. Yeah. And so I got interested in those two aspects of cities, cities that were shaped by changing dynamic processes, and then cities that were shaped by politics and social factors that I couldn't really understand yet.
Yeah. So last week we met with some friends, and one of them noted that he went to school with you. And while he was sort of launching his design career, you were still in school. And you had chosen a different path than a designer, which is somebody who wants to make cities better. Some way, that's the more obvious path, become a designer and go. So what inspired you to become a scholar, a teacher? And also design, but really a scholar and teacher.
I had great role models who were
Yeah.
teachers. So, Harry Porter, an extraordinary landscape architect,
Yeah.
who was one of my mentors at UVA. And then Laurie Olin was also a Scully laureate, who gave me an incredible opportunity as a young landscape architect.
Yeah.
Both of them hired me, one as a TA and one as a young academic. So I had these great role models, and I had some early experiences during recessions to teach, and then later after a bit of practice. But there was a reason that the idea of teaching full-time was compelling versus mixing it with practice. And I noticed in practice, and there's a couple of people here who were in grad school with me, architects who are now really prominent in the city. It's great to see them, and they know how I felt about this, that the way that the landscape was described in so many textbooks and conversations in design firms was through everything that it wasn't. It was informal, irregular, passive, open. There was nothing
Empty.
Yeah, nothing that was full and full of the richness of its medium. And as I started poking around in libraries, I realized that there were hundreds of accounts of amazing work done in the 19th and 20th century that hadn't really yet been interrogated. Firms that were knowledgeable about new theories of geology and ecology, who were folding that into their work in the late 19th and early 20th century, the Olmsted brothers and Jens Jensen. So I realized that that was an area that few people were going into. I mean, fortunately now there are many more garden and landscape historians. But I was interested in occupying a kind of niche between a historian and a designer, and maybe countering what I thought was the overemphasis on ecology with a desire for interpreting sites that were cultural and social, and that were shaped by human agency.
Yeah, and I just would emphasize that one of the ways I think you've inspired so many of us is taking on that teaching role. We don't often recognize the teachers in our lives, and I know there are a lot of students of yours out there, which is really important. I want to talk a little bit about public space, and you brought it up in your own introduction, thinking about the public spaces and the destruction you were seeing. We heard it in the tribute to you and your ability to really reshape how we see, read, describe, and imagine public space and public landscapes. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to a landscape architect and what you think?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's so many professionals that contribute to what really great public spaces are. Architects, planners, politicians, community activists. And I think for me, what motivates me as a landscape architect is twofold. One, understanding that public space is more than the space between buildings. It's actually the conduit for social life and for biophysical processes. And so there needs to be an attention to that as a framework prior to the siting of buildings and the layout of buildings. But the other is really something that struck a chord with me when I moved out of my suburban existence in high school, and you know, Cornell and Virginia, while in towns, they're quite bucolic, right? So it was really not until I was living in Washington and Philadelphia and Boston that I came to appreciate public space in a different way, as an outdoor living room, a place where one had the right to linger, and frankly, a place, the only place really, where one encounters someone not like them. Our suburbs are so segregated by race and income. In the city, it's an incredible gift to encounter someone not like you, to recognize in a stranger their humanity. And I keep in mind something that Richard Sennett, the sociologist, wrote almost 30 years ago when he said that it's through the recognition of a stranger as having humanity that we develop empathy and tolerance, which is the basis of community and democracy. So he's qualifying what public space can be. He's not Olmsted in the 19th century, assuming we all become American and kind of alike in public space. But to think about who has the right to the city, who has the right to linger in public space. I think a lot about the difference between lingering and loitering, and the dignity of being able to linger when you don't have a home that's inside. The dignity of being able to linger when it's the only place you have to be during the day. And so those things that are about the human condition, I think are things that landscape architects ponder a lot. We're in a funny situation, and I'm sorry for people in here who are clients. We actually do a lot of things that are not for the people who pay us. We care a lot about the people who don't pay us, but who may be using space. And I think the combination of those issues plus making a case for nature in public space, both non-human species, but also the energy flows that move through a space. Those are things that a landscape architect can bring to a degree that other disciplines don't necessarily privilege first.
Thinking about the different audiences, and you just talked about some of the different audiences for those public spaces, can you talk a little bit about how maybe the public understanding of public space has changed or is changing? Maybe is it changing?
Well, I mean, I don't know if this trajectory is my own, like this narrative that I've created, but I mean, I remember in the 90s a sense of despair about public space. I'd had the great privilege of working on Bryant Park as a project manager for Lori Olin during the design, development, and construction supervision of that project. And I mean, Lori knows, I mean, I was nervous about the public-private partnership and the amount of control that the park was going to have, and yet I also understand that's fundamental to its success.
Yeah.
It was not in a good place before that renovation. So I had that in mind, a little apprehension about the tidiness, the kind of order that was being imposed on public spaces. And people like Michael Sorkin were writing about that as well, so that there were, you know, a lot of like, oh my God, it's the end of public space because it's too cleaned up, it's too orderly, you can't really do anything because there's a little security person here.
Right.
And then the other side of the end of public space was there's no more public space because it's feral. No one's taking care of it, right? So there were abandoned places, places that were not in good shape, and then places that were too tidied up.
Yep.
And in the middle, this thing called the internet emerged, and another set of critics saying, who needs physical public space? We can create our own communities online.
That was short-lived, thank goodness.
It was not so short-lived. I mean, it was about 10 years, right?
Long history of short-lived.
But you know, it was a moment of, I mean, I remember long conversations with students about whether or not there was anything viable for physical public space. And then, you know, frankly, there was September 11th.
Yeah.
And the degree to which people wanted to be in public space, to see each other in public space. We could talk about what happened with the recession and the Occupy movements, or how we think about different revolutions like Tahrir Square. where the internet, in fact, facilitated that aggregation
physical,
and that kind of constellation of people who became a new public, right? So I think what's particularly interesting now is to realize that you don't hear much about the end of public space. Right. Instead, I think there's a kind of opening up of actually just challenging who we think the public is, making sure that we are as open and empathetic as we can be. I mean, maybe we should talk about it a little bit later and not now, but I know my students are all over the fact that publics include non-human species, and that we need to be dealing with not just human need and life, but recognizing multi-species co-production of place. That we're not there just to protect wildlife and natural resources, but we're all part of a constellation that is in it together.
Yeah. Right? And we will get back to that. But as you talk, I also think about teaching, and remember that moment, again, as a historian, not that long, but probably close to 10 years, when we also thought the university was going to go away, right? That everybody was going to learn online. And, you know, frankly, it's teachers like you that reminded us that there's a very different experience to be in the room with someone. Thinking about public space and design experience of the city, let's talk a little bit more about landscape as an actual medium, that material contribution of landscape to public space. What's that? What are you thinking?
I remember being really defensive about plants when I was young. Like, oh, landscape architecture is more than plants. Well, frankly, you know, at this point, it could just be plants and I'd be happy. So, I mean, a little bit about the medium.
A few animals.
And a lot of critters, yeah. It's such a tricky medium, and people in this room who are designers, you probably feel like me, that you almost start to get it, you know, when you're in your 50s and your 60s. It's a really complex medium, and it's extraordinary. So, I mean, there's a couple things that I just might say that there is such pleasure and joy that comes from the experience of close both interaction with but observation of biophysical things that are changing. Plants and their relationship to atmosphere, temperature, microclimate. And to create places that cause someone in their state of distraction every day to pause and to wonder, I think is a real gift. I've been so inspired by Elaine Scarry, the Princeton philosopher who's written on beauty, where she talks about this moment of wonder in the face of beauty, the kind of beauty that one can imagine in the natural world, and how it arrests time and it causes one to care. So for me, the mastery of the medium is in service of something else, and it's in that effective moment where something happens, the mist rises. I mean, this morning I saw this unbelievable texture on a wall as I was walking along the lawn that I hadn't seen before. And it's realizing that that medium is not a personal thing. It has this ripple effect on others. In terms of writing and scholarship, the medium requires a different kind of language. And so that's been something that I've talked to my students about a lot. In fact, in theory this week, the second-year students, we had this very interesting conversation where the word informal came up, and I was talking about the fact that the land is not just dirt and soil, but it's got shape and form. It has an incredible geomorphology that is precise and dependent on the rigor of process and the chance of circumstance. And to reduce all that to informal and to not to be
Pretty
able to
thin.
say, like at Wellesley College, an amazing campus, that it's actually laid out based on an understanding of glaciated geomorphology, and that Olmsted Jr. described it as an intricate bas-relief. He described it in geological terms in 1900. So the medium and the material is both sensuous and exciting to manipulate, but it also has its own form language, which is too often reduced to words that trivialize the field. And I think the stakes are so high because we can't afford to simply be preserving wild lands out of the city.
Right.
They need to be enmeshed in an urban ecology, and so to not care about the medium enough to describe it with precision, to understand its capacities, and to reduce it to something that's not a grid or not a building, I think does our field disservice. And I think too many landscape architects were doing that when I started practice, and it's heartening to see less of it now.
Change. Can you talk a little bit about some projects that you think not necessarily get everything, but might, as you and I talked about this, we often refer back, right, to walks and such and places.
Well, there's so many. I mean, I have to admit that the opportunity I had to teach early in my career at Harvard and to be thrown into a studio teaching with Michael van Valkenburg, who I didn't know, and it was a little intimidating. And Michael and I developing a friendship that allowed me to really appreciate his work in this regard. I mean, I think Michael loves the landscape medium more than just about any practitioner I know. And I think about the shift he made in his work around Mill Race Park in Columbus, Indiana, where in a floodplain, he created a series of events that might even be understood as registering water and flood levels. It was a direct critique of Parc de la Villette with its gridded follies, because these follies seem to be placed in a way that was hard to describe unless you understood flooding. Right. And then from there, the way in which he and his principals and employees have so assertively shaped the ground at places like Teardrop Park in Lower Manhattan, where he transposes the landscape he loved from Ithaca, like in this amazing constructed wall that makes something of the winter. I mean, to have an ice wall that was in his memory from Cascadilla Gorge transported to Lower Manhattan, and to see that wild space where that material almost seems alive, right?
Yeah.
So I think his firm has been, in many ways, for the last couple of decades, pushing the boundaries of the landscape medium in ways that are surreal and exaggerated and amplified, and they capture the attention. Another public landscape that really moved me recently was one that I saw in Melbourne, Australia, the Cranbourne Botanic Garden. And it is a celebration of native plants. It has a lot of demonstration gardens. But the thing that is so audacious about it is that, like the continent of Australia, about 90% of the botanic garden is inaccessible and dry, to emphasize and concentrate on the wet perimeter. And so to use techniques drawn from other fields like art, right, to create these powerful juxtapositions of sandy, dry space right next to wet waterfalls, irrigating demonstration gardens, is both a beautiful metaphor for the whole continent, but an amazing experience of celebrating plants that, frankly, when the Botanic Garden was open, were still not valued as much as Asian and European imports.
Right. Interesting. That's beautiful. So you've talked a little bit about urban landscapes, talked about grids a bit, geometry, the idea of informal, which I can't agree more, that is just a thin description. Talk a little bit more about, as we are looking forward and thinking about cities as both our greatest opportunity and our greatest challenge in terms of landscape, how does the city-urban landscape common ground, how does this all mesh in together into our work and thinking forward?
That's a big question. How can I parse that one? Can you ask that one again?
Yeah, so I'm thinking that so much of our talk about landscape is about landscapes in the city, but we don't necessarily talk about how the city's shaping the landscape, how the urban character is actually a part and parcel of that landscape. And so besides the grid or something, the site boundaries, but really the urban is a particular way of being in the world. It's a particular relationship. So what does that do with our understanding of landscape?
So I'm going to try to answer this in a couple ways. The easy answer would be, there's all this interesting work being done by people who call themselves landscape urbanists. I'm actually not so into that because I feel like there's not an engagement with the social and the political aspect of cities, and I'm excited about the fact that landscape architects are taking on big urban design projects, and the landscape is being understood as a framework for those. But the city is a place where people come to be with each other. So I want to get back to that in just a minute. But let me just say one more thing about landscape as a kind of framework for urban life. I had this incredible opportunity in 1992 to go up the Mississippi River with Bill Moorish, a fantastic architect and urban designer. And as we went I was there from St. Louis up to Dubuque with John Reps, the urban historian, and William Gass, the novelist. And it was a great experience, drawing and cycling and walking and talking about cities. I realized how fantastic the geomorphology of that river valley was, and how the American grid was laid on that in very precise and fantastic ways. And this city's a great example of that too. Don Hawkins' article a couple of decades ago about the topography before L'Enfant and the way in which certain buildings and precincts are sited high versus low. That had an enormous impact on me. But in the last 10 years, I've come to understand those issues in a totally different way. And with Maurice here, I'm going to share a story about us walking up and down West Main Street. We were both new residents to Charlottesville. Maurice had come from Florence, Italy, very different from Charlottesville, Virginia, in the mid-1990s. I'd come from Boston and Cambridge. And as we were walking between downtown and the university, everyone talks about urban renewal in a place like Charlottesville. It was enormous and so damaging. A neighborhood was torn down in 1965, and today it's still mostly a parking lot and a Staples, a couple of fast food joints. So, it was an incredibly damaging event. But what Maurice and I realized was that up and down West Main Street, old alleys and driveways had been eliminated, separating the bottoms from the ridge. Parcels had gone from 20 feet wide to aggregations of 200 and 300. And so the porosity between the bottoms and the ridge, the working class African American neighborhood, and the ridge that connected the campus to downtown, that porosity was gone, that there was what I would now understand as a racialized topography there. And Maurice and I were saying, we need stairs, we need ramps, I don't know if you remember that conversation. It was before I'd read the Ulan and Worf article on racialized topography.
So unpack that a little bit for us.
So these are two geographers who were looking at southern towns, and in some ways their observations were dumb as do, right? That wealthy white people lived on the ridge, and poor minority families were living in the bottoms. There were health disparities, there were flooding problems, temperature problems because of lack of access to good breezes. And there were a few variations. They were only coastal towns, right?
Right,
So
right.
generally. And I realized that this kind of topographic structure that I had understood as shaping American cities and figuring out where public spaces were, public buildings, major shopping areas, that it had another valence, and that you could read issues of power and race topographically. And it gave me a totally different lens for understanding public space in Charlottesville after the Unite the Right rallies a couple years ago. Our problem isn't just a problem of two squares with equestrian statues of Civil War generals. That is part of the problem. But those two parks were part of a park system in the 1920s that was separate and unequal. We had colored parks and we had white parks. The colored park, Booker T. Washington Park, was on a landfill site. The white park has the most beautiful views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The neighborhoods that were demolished in urban renewal were lacking basic infrastructure because while we didn't have redlining, they'd essentially been redlined, right? So what's been interesting, I think, for me and for the students who are attracted to landscape architecture that I've been meeting the last few years is this recognition that the landscape is a text. It not only is a framework for urban form, but it's also a lens for us to read issues of power and privilege and to then try to resist that, right?
Right, right. Maybe this is a good time to come back to that socio-ecological entanglement. Can you unpack that for us a bit?
Yeah.
It's a great word to try to spell.
So I think it's interesting. How many of you think socio-economic is a weird word? We always say that. Oh, socio-economic, right? But socio-ecological, that just freaks people out, right? So that's a term that, I can't say who coined it. I first read it in David Harvey, the amazing geographer who teaches Johns Hopkins, maybe in the mid-90s. And he was trying to make the case for the right to the city, spatial equity, and access to spaces of nature. He was also trying to make the case that things that we might now think of as environmental racism intermingled social well-being and ecological well-being. So I've been finding the term really helpful as a way of trying to break down the boundaries between humans and the world. My skin is not a boundary between me and the world. Every pollutant
Quite the opposite, right?
goes through this membrane into my body. Right? So we are part and parcel of this larger world, and what we do to it and how we shape it affects our individual as well as our collective well-being. So when you use the phrase socio-ecological, you can't, it's really hard to fall into, oh, it's a grid or a curvy line,
Right.
or it's man-made or it's natural. And you start to think more complexly about how these things are not just intersecting or related, but entangled. It's tricky. It calls into question form and experience, how to diagram things, how to conceptualize things.
Well, and also entangled, it's not clear you can untangle it. And should you untangle it, or is it actually an entanglement that one needs to work within?
Yeah, because it can have negative connotations. Right. On the other hand, this intermingling is something quite extraordinary, right? Here's an example to think about. When we were working on a post-industrial site, it's so easy to think about the novel ecologies that are emerging there as amazing new aggregations of plants, right? Because what is hardy in those environments is not like anything that you find in the
Right.
woods or somewhere
Right.
else. But the fact of the matter is those new novel ecologies, which we're desperately needing, because with climate change and with more and more toxic sites in cities, we're going to need to have a plant palette that's
Yeah.
more robust. Those were also the result of conscious decisions to not care about workers and labor in certain places, right? They're caught up in capitalist greed. That these novel ecologies have a legacy that connects to social and political issues. So I think on almost every level, whether you're trying to describe a landscape, create a plant palette, think about the way in which you start to intermix hedges and perennials and plants within plazas and parks, trying to do that in a way where there's something that's more hybrid and fluid and less binary, I think may be a way to affect everyday users of a place, to start to question maybe some of the separations they've thought about between humans and the non-human world.
And let's follow that up. I mean, one of the legacies that I think you've had as a teacher and a scholar is around this very specific and rich use of language. So you mentioned multispecies and this idea of the non-human, and I've read recently the idea of more than human.
Right.
So talk a little bit, how does that get manifested in landscape architecture in your thinking?
Yeah. So one thing that's great about teaching is that every year you learn, because these awesome students show up who've read things that you never read, and they've got really good humanities educations, which I've been trying to make up for since going to architecture school. And so what I've been introduced to over the last 10 years is some incredible writing by anthropologists and philosophers on what was initially called the non-human turn, and more recently multispecies and more than human. And it's writing that is recognizing the agency of soil and microbes and plants and critters, and that they are in fact living and altering and changing places where we live. I think about that every day as my woods are pruned by these 5 deer, possum, raccoon, fox, hawks, et cetera, et cetera. So here's what's interesting about the writings. I'm thinking about people like Jane Bennett. I mean, there's so many others. And Brian Davis and Jane Hutton in landscape architecture are using this lens to talk about Kate Orff's work at Scape, the kind of oyster architecture work that she's doing up in New York Harbor. So Jane Bennett, in her book Vibrant Matters, talks about the power of things, the liveliness of matter. And she actually makes a case that our interaction with the physical, biophysical world is effective. By that, she means that the emotions and the moods and the aesthetic sensibilities that are engendered through that interaction change our ethics and our ethos. So that's gotten me interested in a kind of extension of my writing about aesthetics and sustainability, which I think was a little moralistic, because I couldn't find the nuance to talk about the difference between individual aesthetic experiences and kind of collective change. And what Bennett's suggesting is that the aggregation of experiences which change your mood can in fact result in a cultural shift or a change.
Yeah.
And she's also interesting because she says that if we start to think about our interaction with the non-human world as a way of expanding our understanding of the public, like public space is not just for us, it's for many species, that there's also some hope when it comes to thinking about strategies for climate change at the site and the space level versus just policy or geoengineering. So here's, in a nutshell, what she writes. She says that if you understand the public not as a group that has everything in common, but in John Dewey's terms, the public is a temporary constellation of bodies that share a perceived threat.
Mm-hmm.
So I think about post September 11th and the way in which all kinds of people came together, this kind of short-lived, unbelievable sense of collective because of a shared perceived threat.
Yeah.
Well, we're not the only ones who are feeling the perceived threat of climate change. I mean, outside of the Dumbarton Oaks wall on Friday, there was a dogwood blooming with leaves that are brown.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
every living species is feeling the extreme conditions. And so how do we start to think about designing for those extremes in the city, finding a kind of gradient of habitats where plants can move and other than human species can move. This may be actually one of the great potentials of one of the tragedies of American city right now, which are the number of cities with vacant lands, shrinking cities, is how to see that as a resource for biodiversity. I mean, the kind of irony is that the design of public space in cities may be more of a reserve for biodiversity than even places farther afield because they're so homogenized because of agriculture or suburbanization.
Right. No, it reminds me, have you read Richard Powers' The Understory?
Yeah, I'm halfway through it.
Oh,
yeah.
Great book.
Yeah.
And just that whole thing of the trees communicating with
Yeah.
each other. So as you're
Yeah.
talking, I was thinking that adds a whole nother layer to,
Exactly.
to the communication.
Yeah.
And I love the talk about language, but let's bring us back, because as Liz noted when she was doing the tribute to you, you've also taken on some other roles. You've been on the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts for a number of years. You're on the Senior Fellows at Dumbarton Oaks, so you've been in D.C. I know you lived in D.C. once. Talk a little bit about the city we're in and how that's shaped what you think.
I love Washington, and I get really tired of people who say, oh, it's not New York or whatever. I love this city. And I've seen it change a lot. This weekend, after the Dumbarton Oaks Symposium, David and I walked around Georgetown, and I was so glad to see Ann Satterthwaite here because I fell in love with Georgetown as a high school student and learned a lot about Georgetown from reading Ann's work and meeting her later. So here's something about Washington that's been fascinating as I've kind of come back on the commission. I've realized that it's a tricky place to design, but there's some really interesting issues that have bubbled up over the past couple of years. I'll think first about public space and security. If there is a model for an American city, an American public space that does not ooze fear, it's the Washington Monument Grounds and Laurie Olin's work there. The proliferation of Jersey barriers and bollards in Washington doesn't exude power or safety, it exudes fear. And so to see a work as beautifully graded and conceived as the Washington Monument, and then Beyer, Blinder, and Bell's recent work to create a really beautiful little glass pavilion to deal with security, I'm really hopeful. Like I see a laboratory that may be a counterpoint to some of the first wave of security responses. The second is that I am in awe of what Gigi Ann did at the Museum of African American History and Culture, where as their budget was getting stripped down and they were having to deal with security again, they had to remove a water body, and they created that extraordinary front thick, beautiful black wall
Yeah.
that has that sheer cut through it. That means you don't have any bollards. That's what it functions as, but you don't see it.
Right.
And it has all of the emotional weight of moving through something and what that connotes. So in a tiny little project, I've seen a firm, I mean, they were like back at us several times to get that right, at a detail that a lot of people wouldn't have spent any time doing. So those
Yeah.
are two
Yeah.
scales of
Yeah,
work.
yeah.
And I think that there, maybe a third, which is really tricky and not resolved yet, is, I mean, the Park Service is so understaffed, and our public landscapes here are so important. So there's just this push and pull about new projects and current projects. And I think about an old project that they have really given life to, the mall, and the way in which they've been negotiating issues of access and free speech and public space with regenerating the lawns so that they're not so impacted. And I know how controversial that is. I mean, who has the right to the city? If everybody does, it's not so great, right?
Right.
There's still a big challenge there, and I think another one that will come into play over the next few years, and that is the challenges between historic preservationists and sustainability advocates. The elms are really struggling on the mall, and they've been there for over 100 years, and I understand the desire to keep them, even though they take a lot of chemicals to stay alive. And if you read the Macmillan Commission report for...
Which I hear you've read the whole thing.
I have read it. They say they picked elms because they're hardy in Washington.
Yeah.
So I think
So
there's
do we keep them if they're not hardy anymore?
Yeah, so
And
I
that's
think
a really-
that's
yeah.
one scale, the World War I memorial, another. We just looked at a possible site for a tiny memorial. They're still finding a site, but it could be at the Marcel Breuer HHS building. So historic preservation issues, whether like a beloved older space like the mall or these mid-20th century spaces that I think for our generation are like Victorian buildings were, back in the 60s, right? I mean, 20 years from now, we're going to think, why did we tear all those places down, right?
Yep.
So I think that that's going to be a really interesting socio-ecological entanglement.
Segment. Yeah.
Historic preservation and sustainability, they're not two things, it's
Yeah.
one, and we don't
And
have
more.
the language for dealing with
Yeah.
those right now.
Yeah. No, it's exciting to hear DC, because you could imagine DC being a city where nothing new, right? That we were entirely stuck. So it's actually kind of inspiring to hear that we're thinking about all these issues and that people like you are helping us. Talk a little bit right now just about what projects you're thinking about, what you're writing. What are you doing now? What words are you coming up with? New phrases?
I'm not generating new words right now.
Okay.
I'm trying to finish a book that I think a lot of you know I've been on again, off again for a long time. So that is The Margins of Modernity, and it's really a recovery of the language of landscape, and I'm really excited about my teaching overload right now, which has given me some time off for the next year, so I can
Banking a little time.
teach a little bit less and write more. I also have a desire to write a book on an important public space in Charlottesville that I think a lot of you know, the pedestrian street that Lawrence Halpern's firm designed in the 1970s. I got an NEA grant a few years ago to start doing research on that. And at one time I thought about it as a history of that space, but I realized the more interesting part, I mean, it's very interesting, the design history, is the city manager and the city planner who were in office so long that they made sure it survived. So there's like the post-design history. And then frankly, more recently, very interesting debates about homelessness on the mall. And we have a homeless shelter that was built near the mall, actually catty corner with Robert E. Lee Park, which means there are a lot more people on the mall during the day who need a place to linger.
Yeah.
And a lot of the center of the pedestrian street, it's only 66 feet wide. You have to pay for a cup of coffee or something
Right.
to be there. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to privatize a public space like that. And I might just share something that I've read recently that's helping me think about the last chapter in that book. There's a book on sitting outside written by a couple of British geographers where they talk about the role of sitting outside as an act of self-care. And that self-care comes from the intimacy of being alone in public, of being quiet among busyness, of being at ease with difference. The term they use is conviviality, that there is an act of self-care. A lot of research has been done in Britain on the increase in human well-being if you're in a space of nature. My colleague Jenny Rowe at UVA has been, whose English has been a big part of that. But these geographers who are doing very interesting ethnographic work are realizing that sitting in public, not because it's in a green space, but because you're in this intimate public space. You have an intimacy, you're not there with anyone else, but for a moment you feel this connection, that it actually is an act of self-care. And when I see a place like the downtown mall that seems very hard about who is the public, someone who can afford a $4 cup of coffee, I realize that this book has a bigger arc that can tie to some contemporary issues.
We're going to open it to some questions from you. So while you think about your question, that seems particularly important, and this is something you and I have talked a lot about. There's this very particular public space and good public space and welcoming. And then there are these very, just want to say scary things: climate change, growing inequities, global issues that, quite frankly, feel overwhelming. So self-care sounds good. But maybe talk a little bit about where you see this work. How do landscape architects help us address? Because we can't turn our backs. We can't put our heads in the sand and hope it goes away. And they're really wicked issues.
Yeah, so I want to start by making a case for actually caring about the physicality and the materiality of small things. And it gets back to what I just said about this issue of caring for those in need, providing places for self-care, and for creating places of beauty, because they move people to act. There needs to be so many responses to the wicked problems we have. And some people are really good at policy and lobbying and advocating, of diagramming huge systems, right? And I get that. But I'm reminded of a gathering I was invited to when I delivered Sustaining Beauty in London at the Royal Geographical Society. And it was in 2006, so think about that. The other keynote were two scientists from the UN's panel on climate change. They had just released the report. They'd been releasing reports since the late 80s, and no one was paying attention. And they said, we realize we've got to find some people to describe the problem because we don't know how to do it. We're hiring graphic designers, we're hiring storytellers, right? Scientists alone, and so what's needed is the will to change how we live and what we consume and what we care about. And I think design matters, and public space matters. And no, it's not saving the planet, but it may be, in fact, altering the ethos of the many people who use and pass through those spaces. You only linger if something feels good to the touch. I mean, we asked Paul to change these chairs because the first chairs were beautiful, but both Thaisa and I were dangling our feet because we couldn't, right? I mean, design matters, right?
It does, yeah.
So this is where my optimism comes from.
Yeah. Actually, it's a nice piece. I was in a class this morning at Mount Holyoke College and talking to students, and one of the students said, I was studying environmental science and I got overwhelmed and then discovered design and felt like I could have agency. I could actually do something, which I thought was a really beautiful. I wanted to sort of frame that moment and say, could I carry you around with me? Yeah. Hopefully she'll do great things. I would love if people have some questions.
Well,
So repeat the question.
yeah, so the question is about the difference between the metaphor of the language of architecture, am I getting that right? And an alternative to that may be focused on the physicality of the thing versus the abstraction of the language. Am I getting there?
Yes, I mean,
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. So it's really the difference between focusing on the craft and materiality of something versus the abstract organization of something through words. That's where this writing of people like Jane Bennett I find so interesting right now. It's called the new materialism. A lot of young architects and landscape architects are reading this body of theory, which is really focused on the physicality of materials, the relationships between both materials and bodies, right? And trying to get away from the abstraction of words and language. The work of Adrian Huge of Westgate, while he wouldn't say I'm reading that, to me is really predicated on the creation of very strong textural contrasts between materials, rough stone, smooth something. I mean, the organization of those places is not complex, and it's not about geometry. It's really about visceral experiences, and it requires a high degree of craft, right, an understanding of how those things come together. So I think your question seems to map onto a lot of the things that I hear students talk about now, and then so interesting that philosophers are talking about it too, a kind of return to things. Bennett describes it as thing power.
Yeah. But do you think talking about the language of design or the language of architecture also helps us understand how it shapes how we see and experience?
Yeah, but I think you're probably
Yeah.
you're probably referring to the influence of literary criticism and structuralism. Like you look about like a little bit younger than me, but I mean, architectural education was very influenced by that for a long time, and it still has residue. So, another way of thinking about it is there's a difference between being a landscape architect and a gardener. I became a lot better landscape architect when I finally owned a piece of land and started to garden. A lot better. I was out of private practice by then. It was a mistake.
Yeah, Charles. Oh, there's a mic coming just behind you.
Oh, wonderful, thank you. To follow up on being a landscape architect, I always get great joy when I go to the CFA meetings and get to hear you speak about both landscape architecture, city shaping, historic preservation. You mentioned the Charlottesville Mall. You're sharing the podium with Thaisa Way from Dumbarton Oaks, and I remember some years ago when you were a fellow and you stuck your nose out when they were going to put the library under the North Vista. I know there are a lot of landscape architects here tonight who are both students and acting professionals, and we've talked about the big issues, climate change. My question for you, Beth, is someone who I've seen be a fierce warrior. Why should landscape architects stick their nose out, and why should they be advocates, and what does that look like?
Did everyone hear that question? Yeah. I remember the first year I taught, and I had the great privilege of having Pete Walker teach the same semester. And he came over for dinner And for those of you who don't know him, Pete's, I don't know, is he in his late 80s now? Amazing landscape architect. And he just said, there is no room in this profession for people who are not warriors. And he's right. I mean, it's a small profession, and most of the things we advocate for, the people who are paying us don't care about, because it's not their thing. Like, we're interested in systems and flows and deep histories. And so you've got to be extremely persuasive in order to make a case. And it's not a lot of fun otherwise. I mean, to be mamby-pamby, sort of kind of landscape architect is just not worth it. You might as well be an accountant, right? So my brother's an accountant. Not my brother who's here, he's an attorney, and he's a fighter too. So I come from a family of fighters, whistleblower protectors, nuclear submariners, emergency room supervising nurses, and I just feel like it's a big part of being a landscape architect is the advocacy role. It feels a lot better 10 years ago, 10 years later, having stuck your neck out and gone through some difficult time than to have not said anything. I was at Dumbarton Oaks last week, seeing that garden, not as a roof garden, but as a real garden. But I didn't go
And a great library.
But I didn't go to Dumbarton Oaks Symposium for 10 years after that, and it was worth it, right, to have that garden still be there. So I don't see the point of not being a warrior. It's easier to sleep at night, and it helps to have friends to call when you need a little backup, so thanks.
Other questions? Yeah. There's a mic coming your way.
Hi,
Beth.
Helen.
Great to see you up there.
You too.
So I took a flight home a few days ago and watched a film I'd been wanting to see for a while called The Biggest Little Farm.
Can you put the mic right up?
Biggest Little Farm. Highly recommended to anybody who hasn't seen it. And I've been pondering the lessons of that wonderful film, and it basically is, I think, a microcosm of what you've been talking about here. Well, yeah, so it's a microcosm of a lot of the things that you've been discussing. And I've been pondering how to bring that back to my little community of Kensington, Maryland, where it's a Victorian garden area, suburb of the 1894, and incorporated the idea that homes should be built among gardens, a place neither in the country nor in the city, but in between, which is what we now call suburbs. But it's still a walkable community, but it's a place also where people feel like if they see a raccoon or a possum scampering about, they have to call a trapper. Right. Or those trees are dangerous. They might drop branches on our house. Yeah. And these great mature trees. And so I ponder about how to bring all of this together back to the communities we live in, and whether they're suburban, urban, or even rural, the lessons that you're describing, that little movie describes so beautifully, are very important. So just thoughts from you on that.
Well, I walked into school and saw probably a 120-year-old tree being taken down in Lewis Mountain neighborhood because it's too close to a house, and right. So I know what you're getting at, but I think even at the neighborhood and local level, it's fascinating to see how aesthetic choices change over time. There's a guy who bought a house on my block recently, and instead of grass in the front, there's this 12-foot patch of crazy grasses and perennials, and he just put a sign up and it said, "Bee Friendly Garden." He's in between boxwood and more boxwood, right? And everyone's cool about it, right? So he's starting a change, and I think that he's made it clear that it's intentional and not neglected. And Joe Nassauer, 20 years ago, wrote a great essay on messy landscapes, orderly frames. It might be a good metaphor for talking about different kinds of aesthetic experience, particularly if they deal with productive plants and messy plants. I don't know the film, I want to see it, but I'm very interested in bringing foraging and edible landscapes back into our public spaces, and that's going to take a lot of persuasion, maintenance people.
But, and I think you could elaborate a little bit. There are ways in which we have come to appreciate very different landscapes. I mean, certainly marshes and swamps, which were once
Right.
an absolute, we don't want them, we fill them in, we drain them, and now we're
Exactly.
building wetlands. And so things, I think things do change
Yeah.
even in a relatively short time.
It's true, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's right behind you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your work
Yeah.
and for the questions that you raised. It influences everyone who care. There is, to bring your point together, there is no greater spokesperson for advocating a redefinition of the word beauty in today's ecology. Helping others understand that it is no longer simply about appearance, although somehow we're all wearing black, but more about health. And so if there are examples and advocates, whether they're using the language that is useful, because we need objects, nouns, we need motion, verbs, we need prepositions to express relationships, but we need this warrior advocacy to help people understand that health is not optional.
Yeah.
And if we can do that as landscape architects in the public realm or at any scale, then we have made the difference that we are uniquely prepared to make. So my question to you is, get on it. Where are you? Why aren't you arguing for health as the new definition of sustainable beauty?
I can't do everything, and I have an incredible colleague, Jenny Rowe, who is doing that. She's newly tenured at UVA. She's been there about 5 years. I hired her when I was the dean. She practiced landscape architecture in England for 10 years before getting her PhD in environmental psychology. So I encourage you to start reading her work. She is just starting to get known in the United States. Jenny Rowe, R-O-E. She's awesome. Yeah.
This will need to be our last
I was going to say last
for the
question.
evening.
Thank you. And I think we have a question right down there. It's right behind you, the mic.
Hey, good evening, Beth.
Hi, Isaac.
How are you? Congratulations. So we've heard about your tenacity, and any of us who've spent a lot of time around you or have had the privilege to learn from you know about the tenacity and sharp critique that you can give when design isn't working or ideas aren't flowing. But we've also all had the opportunity to experience your generosity of spirit, which is, I think, equally the hallmark of your work. And so for those of us that are advocating and working, and all of us in this room, I'm sure, fit into that category, talk to us a little bit or give us a little bit of what continues to inspire you and the well you draw from in order to keep doing this and to keep coming at it with both that tenacity but also that generosity.
Thank you for that last question. Perfect.
Well, I'm looking at a couple of them, actually 3 of them, plus the awesome person who's managing them. New things happen, right? I mean, the ability that I've had to work on the Center for Cultural Landscapes and the Landscape Studies Initiative, Betsy and Allison and these amazing students, right? Like, part of what happens is that like a new tool emerges or a new lens or like a new venue for doing something. The idea of creating a digital resource for teaching landscape history was not on my radar 5 years ago. And then trying to figure out how to do that and to see a group of students who understand that those landscapes matter, like that's been really invigorating. I took a bunch of undergrads to Central Park this semester. Allison and Betsy helped me with that too. And for those of you who don't know, Betsy Rogers, who was the founding director of the Central Park Conservancy, has been a great mentor, and she's here, and Allison James, who's working with me in the Center for Cultural Landscapes. To take 15 undergrads to New York for 3 or 4 days, and they weren't in the A school, they were all, arts and sciences, and to see their landscape literacy just go off the charts. They'd been reading for 5 weeks and doing workshops on how to measure and read landscapes, but to be on site with them and to see how quick that was. So I guess, Isaac, it's a long way of saying that, studio's one thing, but being in the field with students, seeing those light bulb moments when somebody stops talking about it and they start making it and seeing it, it's a blast. It's really fun. So that's part of it. And the other part is it's a lot more fun to be generous and optimistic than to be a jerk. And I don't have the energy to do the jerk thing. I find it a lot easier to do the other.
I think on that note, can we give our own generosity